We use the most powerful AI models to create a debate between two opposing viewpoints in one of the most contentious issues of our time. One representing the pro-deportation stance, advocating for strict immigration enforcement as a matter of national sovereignty and law, and the other representing the anti-deportations perspective, emphasizing human rights, compassion, and the socio-economic benefits of inclusive immigration policies. The debate between these two figures begins now. Should illegal immigrants be deported in USA? Now, let's begin.
When a nation loses the will to enforce its laws, it risks ceasing to be a nation. That's the harsh truth behind our immigration crisis. Like any sovereign country, the United States has both the right and the responsibility to control its borders and determine who may enter or stay. Mass deportation is not easy, but it's necessary in the face of systemic failure. With over 11 million undocumented immigrants, many having overstayed visas, ignored legal processes, or crossed unlawfully, the rule of law cannot be optional. Let's address the ethical concern. Critics call mass deportations inhumane. But is it humane to reward illegality while millions wait to immigrate legally? Is it compassionate to sustain a shadow class vulnerable to exploitation and excluded from legal protections? Every undocumented immigrant undermines those who follow the rules. Mass deportation is not about cruelty, it's about fairness, sovereignty, and justice. The economic cost is significant. A 2020 FAIR report estimated illegal immigration costs. Taxpayers over $130 billion annually, even after taxes are considered. Public schools, emergency health care, and law enforcement, especially in border states, are overstretched. These aren't just statistics. They mean overcrowded classrooms, longer ER waits, and underfunded services. Some argue undocumented immigrants commit fewer crimes. Yet ICE reported over 46,000 criminal arrests of non-citizens in 2022 alone, including serious offenses like homicide and drug trafficking. Even if a minority, should we look the other way? Should laws apply selectively? If enforcement prevents even a fraction of these crimes, is that not justified? The Constitution was never meant as a universal passport. All people deserve basic rights, but constitutional protections have limits, especially when public interest is involved. Compassion must not override the rule of law. Without clear boundaries, empathy turns into chaos. Mass deportation is not about walls or hate. It's about restoring order to a failing system. Without it, the message becomes, laws are optional, citizenship is irrelevant, and borders don't matter. That's not the America I believe in.
A panel of 5 AI judges assessed each response on a 0 to 100 scale, based on carefully crafted evaluation criteria. These criteria were formulated through AI-powered analysis to guarantee objectivity and fairness. Now, let's examine how the models scored the opening statement from the pro-deportation side.
To speak of mass deportation as a matter of restoring order is to cloak systemic injustice in the language of law. The truth is more uncomfortable, more complex. Mass deportations, as they are proposed and often practiced, violate not only ethical norms, but constitutional principles. They sweep indiscriminately, tearing apart families, disrupting communities, and operating with a dangerous indifference to due process, the very bedrock of American justice. Let's start with the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment protects persons, not just citizens, guaranteeing due process before the state may deprive anyone of liberty. In case after case, such as Abrego Garcia v. Garland, 2021, federal courts have rebuked Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, for detaining individuals unlawfully, without hearings or legal representation. This is not hypothetical abuse. It is documented, systemic overreach. ICE's unchecked discretion in expedited removals has been used to deport people who had legal grounds to remain, including asylum seekers and long-time residents. This is not law enforcement, it is lawlessness. And what of the families shattered? A 2018 report by the Migration Policy Institute revealed that over 4.1 million U.S. citizen children have at least one undocumented parent. Mass deportation would orphan countless children, many of whom know no other home than America. The social trauma isn't limited to individuals. It ripples across entire neighborhoods, driving fear into schools, workplaces, and churches. The idea that such sweeping action serves justice overlooks its human cost. Let's be honest, mass deportation is not precise. It's a blunt instrument. It does not distinguish between a violent criminal and a father who overstayed a visa to keep his family safe. That lack of nuance breeds racial profiling, abuses of power, and a growing mistrust between immigrant communities and law enforcement, a mistrust that makes everyone less safe. If we are to be a nation of laws, let us start by ensuring the law protects all people equally. Mass deportation fails that standard, ethically, legally, and humanely.
It is easy to evoke sympathy when speaking of families and children, but sympathy alone cannot be the foundation of national policy. The notion that mass deportations inherently violate due process misrepresents both the legal framework and the scale of the challenge. The reality is this: the immigration court system is overburdened precisely because of lax enforcement and politicized obstruction. We are not facing isolated bureaucratic failures. We are facing a crisis of scale that requires decisive action. The Department of Homeland Security reported that by 2022, the backlog in immigration courts surpassed 2 million cases. Many undocumented individuals are released into the country with notices to appear years into the future, a de facto amnesty that encourages further illegal entry. According to track immigration data, a significant portion of these individuals never show up to court, undermining the integrity of the legal system itself. This is not compassion. It is dysfunction, a system in paralysis. And consider national security. In a world shaped by terrorism and transnational crime, border enforcement is not just about economics. It's about safety. Just last year, U.S. Border Patrol encountered individuals on the FBI's terrorist screening database. While rare, even one breach is too many. We cannot afford porous borders and blind trust. Critics paint ICE as a rogue agency, but ICE operates under statutory authority granted by Congress and upheld repeatedly in federal court. Yes, mistakes occur, as they do in any large system. But to suggest that these errors define the institution is unfair and dangerous. Law enforcement must be held accountable, but it must also be empowered. We don't dismantle the police because of wrongful arrests. We reform and refine. The same should apply here. Mass deportation, responsibly executed, is not about indiscriminate cruelty. It is about restoring credibility to a broken system. Without enforcement, laws are empty promises. If we truly value citizenship and sovereignty, we must be willing to uphold them, not just with words, but with action.
If we truly seek order and security, we must look beyond brute enforcement and examine the root causes of migration, the real impact of mass deportation, and the deeper meaning of justice. Deporting millions en masse does not fix the system. It reveals how broken and reactionary it has become. Behind every statistic is a person, a worker, a neighbor, a parent. Stripping away their humanity under the banner of sovereignty risks transforming our democracy into something far colder, far crueler. Let's interrogate the myth of disappearance. Removing 11 million undocumented individuals is not only logistically impossible, it's economically catastrophic. According to the Center for American Progress, mass deportation would shrink the U.S. GDP by $1.6 trillion over 20 years. Why? Because undocumented workers are deeply embedded in industries like agriculture, construction, and elder care. They pay billions in taxes, including an estimated $11.7 billion in state and local taxes annually. Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, 2017, while receiving few benefits. Deporting them en masse would upend local economies and devastate small businesses. Even more troubling is the social precedent. When we normalize large-scale removals of people without individualized assessments, we slide toward collective punishment, a principle fundamentally opposed to the rule of law. Legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin argued that rights are trumps against the majority's will. If undocumented individuals can be deported without real hearings, without the chance to argue for asylum, family unity, or community contribution, then the law ceases to serve justice. It becomes an instrument of exclusion. And no, this is not a call for open borders. It's a call for proportional, lawful, and humane enforcement. We need more immigration judges, not more raids. We need earned pathways to legal status for long-term residents, not icy raids at workplaces and schools. Reform, not removal, should be our guiding principle. True order is not imposed by force. It's built on legitimacy. And mass deportation, in both form and function, erodes the very legitimacy we claim to defend.
Let's not confuse dysfunction with inevitability. Yes, our immigration system is broken, but that does not mean we abandon enforcement. It means we enforce smarter, with resolve. Mass deportation, done within legal frameworks and with targeted strategy, is not collective punishment. It's the reassertion of national boundaries. Without the credible threat of removal, every visa overstay and unlawful entry becomes a calculated risk, one too often rewarded. We must dispel the romanticism that all undocumented immigrants are victims or economic heroes. That narrative, while emotionally resonant, obscures real harms. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has documented wage suppression in low-skilled sectors where undocumented labor is concentrated. Legal workers, including recent lawful immigrants and naturalized citizens, are forced into unfair competition. Employers exploit this shadow workforce, bypassing safety regulations and undermining labor rights. By failing to enforce immigration law, we entrench a two-tier system that hurts everyone. And while some undocumented individuals contribute economically, many rely on public services without contributing proportionally. A 2017 report from the National Academies of Sciences acknowledges that while children of immigrants may become net contributors over time, first-generation immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, often impose net fiscal costs at the state and local level. This isn't xenophobia, it's a matter of arithmetic. Tax revenue is finite, and priorities must be set. Let us also not forget the millions who follow the legal path, who wait years, even decades, for visas. What message do we send them when we look the other way on unlawful presence? That their patience was naive? That rules are negotiable for the politically sympathetic? Mass deportation affirms the sanctity of those rules and clears the way for a more orderly, merit-based system. Reform must begin with enforcement. Compassion without structure is chaos. By restoring order, we can then build pathways for those who qualify, not just those who arrive first or shout the loudest.
Before we talk of rules and lines, we must ask, who drew those lines, and who has always been asked to wait behind them? America is, by every measure, a nation of immigrants, except for native peoples. whose lands were colonized, and enslaved Africans, who were brought here by force. Every other American family, at some point, came here from somewhere else, often under conditions that would today be deemed unlawful or irregular. To forget this history is to misunderstand what immigration has always meant in America: struggle, exclusion, and eventual belonging. Mass deportation ignores this foundational truth. It pretends that today's immigrants, often brown, poor, and non-European, are uniquely problematic, but the same accusations were once hurled at Irish, Italian, Chinese, and Jewish migrants. They take our jobs. They don't assimilate. They're criminals. The faces change. The fear remains. What we're witnessing is not a response to legal violations, but a continuation of historical scapegoating, dressed in legal language, but powered by cultural anxiety. And let us talk about law, since that word is invoked often. Laws are not sacred simply because they exist. They are just or unjust, based on how they are applied and whom they protect. When enforcement disproportionately targets Latinos and other communities of color, when ICE ignores court orders and detains people without cause, we are no longer defending the law, we are perverting it. That is not justice. That is legalism without legitimacy. Furthermore, enforcement that tears parents from children, deports veterans who served this country, and removes essential workers during a pandemic is not smart. It is self-defeating. We lose not only productivity, but trust. Trust in the system, in our values, in the promise that America belongs to those who build it, not just those who inherit it. We can and must control borders, but we must also ask, who are we controlling them against? When we remember that almost all Americans are immigrants, we must reckon with the possibility that mass deportation doesn't just betray our history, it betrays who we claim to be.
History should guide us, but it should not paralyze us. Yes, America was built by immigrants, but it was also built by laws, by borders, by the hard decisions that hold a diverse society together. We cannot conflate Ellis Island with an open border, nor can we let historical guilt justify present disorder. The legacy of immigration does not require the abandonment of enforcement. In fact, honoring that legacy means preserving the very system that made legal immigration possible. The selective outrage over deportations often obscures the moral complexity of governance. What does it mean for a nation to tolerate law-breaking simply because it is emotionally or politically inconvenient to act? Every government has a moral responsibility not only to welcome but to regulate. When millions enter or remain unlawfully, it's not just a policy problem. It's a breach of the social contract, one that sows distrust and cynicism among citizens and legal immigrants alike. Moreover, mass deportation need not be interpreted as a single, militarized sweep. That's a caricature. In practice, it can, and should, be a phased, prioritized process. Criminal aliens first. Repeat immigration violators next. Then overstays with no family or community ties. A 2019 Government Accountability Office, GEAO, report showed that a significant portion of ICE's removals already targeted individuals with criminal convictions. What we lack is not the discretion. We lack the political courage to scale enforcement to meet the crisis. The moral argument cuts both ways. Is it moral to ignore millions of people living in the shadows, easily exploited, denied dignity, yet never fully accepted? Or is it more moral to restore clarity? To say, here are the laws, here is the path. If you are not on it, there will be consequences. Consequences are not cruelty, they are clarity. They uphold the rule of law and the integrity of the system. America's future as a lawful, sovereign democracy depends on more than compassion. It depends on the courage to uphold difficult truths. And one of those truths is this: without enforcement, law becomes theater, and justice becomes hollow.
There is a difference between enforcing the law and using it as a shield for injustice. That difference lies in intent, proportionality, and humanity. The argument that mass deportation is simply clarity rings hollow when clarity comes at the cost of constitutional rights, family unity, and moral credibility. A lawful society is not one that blindly punishes. It is one that distinguishes, deliberates, and prioritizes dignity alongside order. We must ask, what kind of society do we become when we normalize the large-scale removal of people without meaningful due process? The Fifth Amendment protects all persons, not just citizens, yet under current enforcement practices, including programs like expedited removal, individuals are deported without access to legal counsel, often in violation of court rulings. In Zadvidas v. Davis, 2001, the Supreme Court held that the government cannot detain non-citizens indefinitely. Yet IC has continued to use indefinite detention tactics. These are not isolated missteps. They are symptoms of a system that sees legality as a pretext for power, not justice. Moreover, the argument that mass deportation would be phased and strategic collapses in practice. It hasn't been. Under previous administrations, across both parties, we've seen parents arrested during school drop-offs, veterans deported despite honorable service, and thousands removed to unstable countries where their lives are endangered. The ideal of targeted enforcement is repeatedly betrayed by reality, and economically, the cost of mass deportation goes beyond lost labor. A 2016 study by the Center for Migration Studies found that undocumented immigrants are deeply embedded in American life. 63% have lived in the U.S. for over a decade. These are not transients, they are neighbors, community pillars. They coach youth teams, care for the elderly, rebuild hurricane-ravaged towns. To strip that away, in the name of abstract order, is not moral courage. It's institutionalized harm. Justice without compassion becomes a tool of exclusion. We must stop confusing severity with strength. True strength lies in reform, in recognizing that immigration, like democracy itself, must be shaped by values as much as by rules.
Compassion without structure is chaos, and chaos over time breeds resentment. That resentment is already here. Millions of Americans, including legal immigrants, see a government that punishes compliance and rewards defiance. They see a border that leaks and a bureaucracy that breaks. When enforcement becomes the exception rather than the rule, disillusionment follows. And disillusionment is dangerous. It erodes the civic trust that holds a diverse society together. Let's be clear. The failure of past administrations to implement consistent, credible enforcement has created this crisis. That failure is bipartisan, but inaction should not now justify surrender. We need not choose between humanity and enforcement. We must do both. But we must start with restoring the principle that immigration law matters. Mass deportation, when paired with better legal pathways and adjudication resources, can be part of that restoration. Think of the precedent we set for future immigration waves. If we allow millions to remain despite unlawful entry, what message do we send to the next generation of would-be migrants? That borders are optional? That legal channels are for the unlucky? That is not compassion. It is cynicism dressed as empathy. It tempts millions to risk their lives on dangerous journeys, fuels trafficking networks, and empowers coyotes. Strict enforcement, by contrast, sends a clear, consistent signal. There is a legal way in, and it matters. This does not mean targeting individuals at random. It means strategic action supported by data, prioritizing criminals, overstays, and recent arrivals. It means expanding immigration courts so cases can be heard swiftly and fairly. It means restoring deterrence so that enforcement is proactive, not reactive. Deportation must not be the only tool, but it must remain on the table.
To suggest that deportation restores faith in law is to mistake fear for respect. People do not trust institutions that treat them as disposable. True legitimacy comes not from severity, but from fairness, and fairness demands we consider context, history, and human consequence. Mass deportation, even when labeled strategic, still fails on these counts. It is reactive, not reformative. It targets symptoms, not causes. And in the process, it punishes people who are deeply woven into the fabric of American life. Consider the hypocrisy embedded in this debate. We welcome the labor of undocumented immigrants to harvest food, build homes, and care for our children, but threaten to expel them once their presence becomes politically inconvenient. This is not rule of law. It is opportunism, and it reveals how enforcement, when driven by quotas and optics, quickly loses moral coherence. More importantly, mass deportation ignores the actual solutions that experts and communities support. The American Bar Association has long called for increased immigration judges, legal representation for asylum seekers, and a streamlined system that balances enforcement with protection. The American people agree. A 2021 Pew Research poll showed that 69% of Americans favor providing undocumented immigrants who meet certain conditions a pathway to legal status. Mass deportation flies in the face of that consensus. And as for deterrence, harsh enforcement does not stop migration, it simply pushes it underground. Studies from the National Immigration Forum and other bipartisan policy groups show that deterrence-only strategies have limited short-term effects, while comprehensive reform, including legal pathways, visa modernization, and smart border investment, create lasting, humane outcomes. If deterrence were enough, we wouldn't be here. We cannot restore the rule of law by undermining its spirit. Justice requires more than uniform application. It requires discernment. It requires us to ask not just what the law says, but what it should serve. And a system that tears apart families, ignores due process, and flattens moral complexity is not just flawed, it is unjust. Mass deportation does not make us safer, it makes us smaller, in vision, in courage, and in compassion.
In the end, the heart of this debate isn't about numbers or courts. It's about the moral and civic weight of belonging. And that's precisely why the rule of law must be upheld. Without it, belonging becomes arbitrary, identity becomes politicized, and justice becomes emotional theater. I do not deny the hardships, the human faces, the moral gray areas. But hard cases cannot dictate broad policy. Compassion must operate within structure, or it ultimately fractures both society and the very individuals it seeks to protect. It's become common to frame enforcement as inherently inhumane, to argue that borders are trauma lines and deportation is synonymous with cruelty. But that's a reductive view. It ignores that every nation, to survive and function, must draw lines. And enforcing those lines, fairly but firmly, is not a betrayal of American values. It is their preservation. The rule of law is what protects the weakest. It is what allows for stability, trust, and the possibility of just reform. We cannot continue to build a system around exceptionalism, around the idea that undocumented presence should always be forgiven, always be tolerated, always be adjusted after the fact. That mindset undermines the very goals of immigration reform. It creates perverse incentives, weakens national cohesion, and erodes the belief that laws are meant to apply to all, not only those we have the political will to confront. I believe in legal immigration. I believe in reform. I believe in dignity. But none of that can exist meaningfully unless we are willing to enforce what we legislate. Mass deportation, properly administered, is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of institutional renewal, of clearing the system of dysfunction so that a better one might take its place, with clearer laws, swifter justice, and legal paths that truly mean something. That's not turning away from America's promise. It's honoring it.
Let me end where this debate truly begins, with people, with mothers who wake up each day unsure if they'll return home at night, with children who speak perfect English, recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and live in daily fear that ICE might break their world apart, with veterans who wore the uniform of this country only to be exiled from it. These are not abstractions. They are the reality of mass deportation. And if we are honest, we must ask, what does it say about a country that makes its home so precarious? Enforcement is not inherently unjust, but when enforcement becomes synonymous with indiscriminate removal, racial profiling, and the erosion of constitutional safeguards, we have moved from law to punishment, from justice to spectacle. This country, at its best, is not defined by how it treats the powerful, but by how it protects the vulnerable. And undocumented immigrants are among the most vulnerable, economically, politically, and legally. Let's also recognize that legality evolves. Anti-miscegenation laws were once legal, so were literacy tests, Chinese exclusion, and redlining. Legality must always be weighed against justice, and justice, real justice, asks not only what a person did to get here, but who they are, what they contribute, and what our shared humanity requires of us. The idea that presence without papers erases worth is morally bankrupt. We need solutions, we need laws, but more than anything, we need vision. A vision that sees immigrants not as intrusions, but as continuations of an American story that began long before ICE, long before green cards, long before immigration was weaponized for division. Mass deportation will not make us more secure. It will not restore order. It will tear at the nation's moral seams, punishing those who already live among us, who build, care, teach, serve, and believe in this country as their own. If we want to fix immigration, we must begin not with who to expel, but with who we're willing to embrace. Because at its core, America is not a fortress. It's a promise. And that promise is only as strong as our willingness to extend it to others.
This debate wasn't about proving one side right or wrong. It was about exploring how advanced language models reason, argue, and weigh complex issues like immigration, not to dominate, but to understand. The question of whether illegal immigrants should be deported is layered with history, law, ethics, and identity. Both perspectives offered insights that challenge and inform. Our goal was simple: show what thoughtful, structured dialogue can look like, and maybe inspire better conversations among us humans. If this sparked reflection, curiosity, or even respectful disagreement, then it worked. Subscribe to our channel for more AI debates that aim not to shout, but to clarify.